So now that we have everybody wired and ready for the discussion, I actually wanted to give the podium to our young scientists, and maybe let me open this with a remark. You have sitting next to you 5 gentlemen, 60 plus, gray hair. 70 plus. 70 plus, that's 60 plus, you fall under that. Of course, we have been part of the problem. And I think it's up to the young generation now to challenge us. So I want to invite you to ask the questions.
Yeah, so I may start with a... Can you hear me?
Yeah.
So I may start with an introductory question. I can actually not remember ever being told that technology will save us from everything, or that we can just continue that the way we're doing it now. But as I've learned from my parents, there was a different time, and where the trust in technology and pesticides and whatever was much larger. And I wanted to ask you if you could share something, impression or a picture which made you change your mind so that we cannot continue the way we are, and maybe when that was and when or what happened since then.
You want to ask one person specifically?
No, not necessarily. I think you can all maybe answer.
Okay. Why don't we start with Dr. Töpfer, and that you perhaps answer this, and keep your answer short, please.
It's not very polite to start with the oldest, but nevertheless. Pardon?
Yeah.
Fine, but of course it would be a disaster if I wouldn't have the chance and the obligation to change my mind in such a life. You see, if you are a minister in Germany, developed countries, and you come from one day to the other in the middle of Africa, and you are not changing your minds, and you are not changing your view to the world, then it is a disaster. And we must be much more open, I believe, also for those changes. That is not easy to underline also in the scientific world. You know, I'm a student of Karl Popper. Maybe you don't know him, but he is one of the outstanding science theoretical person in those days when I grew up. And he always gave us a recommendation that science is linked with falsification, not with verification. And this is a question of tolerance in science as well. And therefore, yes, I changed again and again. Giving you the final quote, my hero as a philosopher is an unknown philosopher, Baltasar Gracian, Spanish Jesuit of the 16th century. And he once mentioned that steadiness belongs to the will, not to the brain. You must be able to change, but you must have the will to do it. And having this in mind, yes, I listen to wonderful results of my scientific colleagues in climate. But at the end of the day, I ask, where is the consequence for our action on scientific basis as well? And what do we have to do to convince people that this needs action? Because the analysis is great, but the action is necessary.
Maybe we should let Dr. Nelson also comment on, perhaps explain to us where you see the silver lining on the horizon, or is there no silver lining?
Well, to respond to the question, you know, as a scientist, I want to see empirical results of what the problem is. And so I have a global concern, and so I look at global results. But when I look at my neighbors in Grand Junction, Colorado, they are not scientists. They're farmers and ranchers and grape growers. And what they respond to are things that challenge them directly. And so the picture that I want to eventually convey to them, and I need help from my colleagues like David Battisti over there, who's a really renowned climate scientist, is to be able to take these global results and translate them locally to what the consequences are for the farmers in the hills around here, for example. And so I think the challenge for us is to, first of all, to translate that information from the global to the local. And then the second thing is to encourage our students that consider a career in politics. If you want to make change, you've got to do it through the political system, and that means you need to get involved in it.
Dr. Schneider.
When we look at the technological progress and how it has been adapted or not adapted, I think the scientists and maybe also the extensionists have not taken enough care to really work with the local population who has to actually adapt it. So many things work in the lab and in pilots, but then when you want to upscale it, they don't work because we do not spend enough time and money and effort in education and training, and also listening to the ones who have to adapt it and adopt it. So in that sense, I think in the transformation of research results into practice, we have not done a good job.
Beverly?
I'm a lawyer. My solution is in the law, not in technology. And I give you one example, and that's land tenure. If you own the land, you increase productivity and you look better after the land also in an ecological sustainability. Countless examples. The fish pond in Vietnam after 20 years goes back to government so they can't take care. Nomads, given land, will in Mongolia better look after it. You have communal, traditional land ownership. If that is better safeguarded, that is also a guarantee against land grabbing. But basically the question of the lease, even if it's a lease only, if it's for 20 years, erosion is guaranteed. If it's for 99 years, that's 3 generations, and the farmer will look at it, even though he's not formally, legally the owner, like in China, for instance. This is the silver lining, not the silver bullet.
Fatima, let me come to you. I think you have a very interesting perspective coming from Singapore.
Actually, I'm originally from Pakistan. I did my bachelor's in Singapore.
Oh, okay, good. Well, that was not in my
and
notes.
And then I did my master's in Germany.
But still, I mean, you spent time in Singapore, and then that is, of course, a country where, it's actually a big city where there's very little to no agricultural production. And then, of course, if we think in terms of future cities, and you perhaps know that at ETH we have a large project on future cities together with Singapore, then, what is your perspective actually on how we're going to feed the world in the future?
Well, I mean, when we look at the food waste, there's two sides of the coin. One is that there's too much food waste in the developed world, and the other one is there's food waste at the production level of the farmers. And when I look at a city like Singapore, where of course food is again subsidized, just like in Switzerland, and there is a huge focus on junk food, because in mega cities like Singapore, the life is really fast-paced, and there isn't much time to cook, and hence they eat a lot of junk food. And that also results in a lot of waste of junk food as well. So the easiest answer to say is the cultural change, that people realize what they are doing and they become aware of it. But as we also talked about it, that cultural change is the least, the one that has the maximum resistance to it. So my thinking would be that, like coming from grown up in Pakistan, where there is little to no waste at household level, we'll just eat everything that's in the fridge for a period. We should increase the prices of the food to what it is, what it should be, instead of giving all the subsidies to the farmers. And then when it becomes a 25% share of a normal Singaporean income to pay for food, they will think 2 to 3 times before they actually throw something in the dustbin. Or they will cook more as well, at home as well. So, of course, these are very difficult questions, but then the point is, where is the will to implement by the politicians and by people to follow? I am more hopeful because of the new generation that I see, which is called Generation Y or Generation Z, that there's already a bigger push towards young people's mindset of life purpose and self-actualization. It doesn't stop with houses and cars and stuff like that. Of course, it could be biased because I'm coming from the educated strata, so I meet the people who are like me and around me.
Yeah, but you are the young generation. I mean, how do you challenge the older generation, which of course in part has been part of the problem? Okay, so what is your challenge to the speakers? What do you want us to do?
Well, the one thing that I simply just mentioned, let's say we can have kind of a voting at this moment. How many people will be willing to pay 7 Swiss francs for a liter of milk tomorrow?
Yeah, but the interesting thing is that I mean, we have of course already brought up the issue of politicians, and of course many decisions are influenced at the political level.
Yeah.
You know, so why don't we, as a society, develop a simple formula that we say, okay, we elect a politician for 4 years, and that politician must now think about the future for the next 20 years. Okay, think forward 20 years. And then after 4 years, you elect the next politician, and that politician has to think about the 20 years after the 20 years. And in 20 years, we have 5 generations of politicians, sometimes have become re-elected, but you would still force them to think forward. And think about the problems that we have been discussing here, 2100. How do we solve the problem? Okay? So I want to go, again, through the round, maybe this time starting here. So if we are thinking forward, what should we accomplish at the political level?
Well, that's my home turf. FAO says this world can feed 12 billion people. That doesn't mean we can solve all the problems, but it could indicate that production is not the main and certainly not the only problem. What Mr. Nelson just said also was music in my ear. We need to keep borders open. Trade must be the tool by which food flows where it is needed and when it is needed. Except for people with less than $1 a day, those people must be fed by other measures. But everybody earning more than $1.50 or $2 must pay for their food, otherwise the farmer doesn't get paid for his or her efforts. So the WTO must return to action, and unfortunately, I'm very pessimistic about that, as I said this morning.
Dr. Schneider, where do you want to see us in 2100?
Well, we still have approximately 1 billion poor people, and many of them are farmers and livestock keepers. I think we have to make more efforts to support them to have a meaningful life and a safe life and life without hunger.
Dr. Nelson.
Well, I won't be around in 2100, so my views on the matter probably don't matter too much.
The answer is too easy.
But what I would like to do is to provide my children and their children with the opportunities to choose what they'd like to do rather than have to live with the consequences of the bad stuff that we're doing right now.
So now we hear the answer from the politician.
You see, if you have wonderful ideas for 20 years to go and develop it as a politician, as you rightly mentioned, at the end of the day, you must try to make those ideas also accepted by the majority of the people, of the voters, in an open democracy. That is the litmus test. You can have the wonderful ideas, but if you cannot convince the people, it may be that it is to criticize a politician for being short-term oriented. But mainly politicians are also mirroring the overall feeling in the society they elected them. So it is not as easy simply to say you must have the good ideas. The good ideas are not only a result of science, and they are changing. You know, when I started my political activities on the federal level, we had to fight dying forest problems, Waldsterben. We were informed by scientists that is directly linked with SO2 and NOx emissions. That is acidification, and this is changing the soils. And so we fight it, SO2 and NOx. If you ask now the scientists, they come back and say, most probably it was a topic, but there were other reasons as well. All our decisions in human life are decisions with incomplete information. If we would have full information, we would be a divine being. Incomplete information is always to take decision under the condition of risk. You may be correct, and you may be not correct. And therefore, it is not only to think what could be, but make it also the probability. All what is mentioned in the climate science is a probability linked with models. I trust this. I'm not a skeptic. By the way, it is already a disaster that you must prove I'm not a skeptic. In science, always it is necessary to be skeptic concerning the results of the previous time. That was what you asked. And therefore, again, you can consider in this field more and more what is to integrate in more development of democratic preconditions. Last sentence. In our discussions we have at home and not there, we see, and there was a wonderful article from one of our political scientists under the headline, "The Foreseeable End of Representative Democracy." Why? If you ask for short-term, the short-termist ever are the financial markets, are the economic architecture. And who in the politics is able to echo on a longer term, on the short-term request of the market? By the way, who is legitimizing markets? Are they people? Are they elected? Are they in line with our common interest? And therefore, my main concern is that we are living in a dictatorship of short-termism. And we are doing it, luckily, we are externalizing wherever possible, and then we believe other people can solve the problem we didn't pay in our prices.
Okay. That was a very distinct statement.
No.
So,
Therefore,
but Dr. Töpfer, you brought up also the issue of distortion that we certainly have at the global, in the world today. And I think we should just, apply the physical laws here and make it very simple. And that is that according to the physical laws, the diffusion is always from the highest concentration to the lower concentration, okay? So, and I want now, under these considerations, pass on the questions to the young generation. So, and take a shorter term view perhaps. Aline and Fatima, what would you like to have accomplished by 2050? So then you are 50 plus, you're almost at the age that we are. So where would you like the world to be in 2050?
Well, I think that's a very difficult question, but maybe it's just very close to yours, saying, I also want to be at a stage saying, I can give this earth further to a next generation. In this time, I will be at your stage of life and also thinking, what have I done, or how, can I really say that I've done most I could to preserve this world and give it further to the next generation?
Fatima?
Well, I guess it's the same what same in line with Aline, that what did I do with my life? And actually the biggest thing that at this moment is what we had heard in the last 2.5 days. We have a lot of problems, we have solutions, and we have like 1% implementation of those solutions. And I actually also had a very interesting case, if I would just elaborate a little bit on it, that on the very first day we had a representative from Nestle who talked about that how Nestle had invested in Pakistan, where they gave equipment to farmers, milk farmers, to save their milk from 10 to 15% of milk loss that happened to a very minimal loss. And hence, the milk that is produced, because Pakistan produces a lot of milk, the loss of milk was prevented. However, what he didn't say was that farmers were only allowed to sell that milk to Nestle only. And Nestle was exporting all that milk to Middle East and to NATO forces in Afghanistan. Now, I have grown up in Pakistan drinking milk which was brought by a local milkman, and my mother would pasteurize the milk by heating up, and it was perfectly fine. And even now, it is not feasible for middle or middle-high class families of Pakistan to drink packaged milk because it's too expensive, and we have an alternative. So when Nestle invested this in 2-3 years ago, they took maybe 15 to 20% of farmers who were in this, like the market of milk in Pakistan towards their side, and hence now my parents are paying a higher price of milk, which was cheaper because of the investment of Nestle. And actually that is a question that when we implement these solutions, I mean, I can see from Nestle's point of view, why should they bother to invest in a country on a philanthropist point of view? They want profit and they want something out of it, and they of course are getting it. So to the point of how I would like to see that we have those solutions which empower the local people and make them the stakeholders in it. Because a farmer who got that investment from Nestle would probably sell enough till Nestle leaves, and then he would be rich enough to sell all his cows and move to the city. And that's where it would end. So I have actually a question for all the 4 people here, that what are the drivers and dimensions that will implement sustainable solutions in developing countries? Because we have a lot of solutions. The implementation is already very little, but even which I at least can see is implemented by companies like Syngenta has a heavy cost for the locals.
So, Dr. Eberle, do you want to start with an answer? What are the drivers? How do we turn things around?
Just to continue, there's a lot of stories about Nestle Pakistan. You've seen their beautiful slides, and you've seen here some other stories. I can't go into that, but I take your examples as one which I put on a blog in this event here. I think between food safety and food security, there's a trade-off which we're not aware of, we are not sufficiently discussing even in this conference. The higher your food safety standard is, and some people were saying already on Wednesday, we will not make any compromises on the health and so on and so forth. But that means the more expensive your food is, until your parents, middle class, cannot even afford it. So that's one takeaway which I'm thanking you for letting me say that also here before we go. The other one is what I said this morning. We need for governments to find the right type and level of support, and not only to farms, you're perfectly right. As I said, farm security is one thing, but food security is much bigger. And this type of support, which then has no negative spillovers on other farmers in other countries or in the same country, on small farmers even, what we had yesterday, this is the challenge. And I think there are answers, there are measures showing the way forward.
Dr. Schneider.
We often make the mistake when we talk about the private sector in connection in the context with development that we only talk about the multinationals, the big ones. But I've been in India for many years, and there are hundreds, thousands of small, medium enterprises at local level which are private and which do a good job, and which also they want to make money, but they make it there and they spend the money there. So I'm convinced that the hunger problem and the food problem we cannot solve without the private sector. It's not the development agencies or the NGOs who are solving it. We have to make best use of the private sector, but the private sector is not just Syngenta and Nestle.
Dr. Nelson, you had a very pessimistic outlook that we can keep the carbon dioxide emissions at reduced levels. What do you think is really necessary to turn things around?
Well, so a couple of thoughts on this general area. The first one is it's really important to understand what the interests of the actors are in this area. So Syngenta is in the first place, it's a for-profit company, and its business for its shareholders is to make money. And we've layered on some additional things, corporate social responsibility, which changes the emphasis of what they do a bit, but fundamentally you need to understand that Nestle's in the business of making money. And other actors in the area have similar sorts of interests. So I was just going to challenge you a little bit on, earlier you suggested that we should get the price of food to be 25% of the average Singaporean income. So you want to raise the prices of the food in Singapore. But then when we talk about the price of milk in Pakistan, you're a little more concerned about that. So this is, I'm not saying that this is a bad thing, but you just need to look at the interests of the people that are involved in the decision-making process. And so that's one point I wanted to make. Look at the interests, if you will, follow the money, but it's not just about money. But the second thing is that people do change their interests and they change their actions. And at least in part, they do that on the basis of information. So I think it's really important that we help all of the actors to understand the consequences of what they do, and that's what researchers should be doing, and I try to do, and other researchers as well. So it's both doing the research and getting the research into the hands of the actors so that they can understand the consequences of what they're doing. And then the third thing is, really, as I said earlier, the way you make changes, the important way you make changes is through the political process. So the point about land rights is a classic example of where the political process sets up the nature of the whole ownership of various kinds of assets, whether it's the physical asset of land or intellectual property, all those sorts of things. That's done in the political process. And so again, I encourage the young folks in the room who haven't already to get involved in the political process, to take your research and understanding into that process so that it becomes better informed, recognizing at the same time that there are these different interests, and as you go into the process, you'll be representing some and not others, and that's just the way life is.
Dr. Töpfer, since you're in the institute that wants to make change, what is your recommendation?
I don't have the answer to this $1 million question. And if I had one, I was better off in Africa and the United Nations system altogether. But there may be some cornerstones for this. First, do whatever is possible to develop solutions in the regions, out of the regions. Don't import only solutions. I think it is easy to say, difficult to handle. But there are lots of good answers in this. Start to avoid the globalization of the Western consumption behavior. Again, easy to say. We made a study on the influence of culture on development perspectives on the case of Latin America. There is the Andean countries having not the maximization of GDP, but Pachamama and Bon Vivre. Is that a change? We want to do the same in India with my friend Ashok Khosla, quite a well-known figure in this field. And he mentioned to me, forget it, it's gone. The behavior change gives you the change in a lot of other consequences. I give you one concrete example. If you compare India and China with their retail system, the retail system in China is already in a, let me say, Western style. They have self-service and all this. That means packaging that is increasing of energy intensity. In India, they made even a public activity, a political activity to save the smaller shops with a lot of jobs. India per year has to create something about 20 million new jobs for the young people. Where are those coming from? And our answer in our surrounding is always, our bottleneck is labor. All our technologies are labor saving, and they are more capital intensive and they are more energy intensive. They are not the adequate technologies in lots of those parts. And therefore, it is not only ideal recommendation start there, but be aware of the limitations there. And this is capital, that is energy. And so they need labor-using technologies we didn't develop. They need water-saving technologies we did not develop. Do you believe that our sanitation techniques would be developed in a water-scarce country? Answer to limits. Therefore, I'm very sure we have to rely on their capacity as well. If I look 36 years back in my life and ask what was then, 1974 or 6, there was no solar. If you mention solar, you say, stupid guy, smiling was the best you could have as a reaction. There was no wind, the same reaction. Go through all this.
Yeah.
2050 is 36 years far away. I'm 100% sure that is not only stupid optimism, but the young people will react to the bottlenecks they have to overcome as we try to solve our problems as well.
Yes, and I completely, thank you very much. I completely agree with this. I'm also a very strong believer we need solutions on the ground, in the locale where they are needed. And it is our responsibility to help providing those solutions. I think we have to come to a conclusion here. I think in these last 2 days we really had fantastic opportunities to not only hear about the problems but also start thinking about the solutions. Unfortunately, from the workshops yesterday, I realized that we don't get the summaries in a presentation, but the summaries from these workshops will actually be available on the web. So these were very pragmatic discussions on how to actually develop solutions. So before I give the floor to the president of the Academia, Engelberg, Hans Groth, I want to ask Aline and Fatima to give us the final advice on the way at the end of the meeting. Aline?
Yeah, well, I would maybe like to go on something we have been discussing under us young people here several times this week. There were many solutions going this way, going totally the other way, but there was one thing coming up really several times, and it was actually the thing about the meat. And it was the paradox of this conference that we had meat 3 times a day. And yeah, we were talking about what solution or what could every single person of us contribute to change, and that would maybe be a change we could easily also perform.
Fatima?
My final thoughts is actually the issue of food security is actually not in 2050 or it's 2030. It's actually right now. Because what we have not talked about or discussed at all is that hungry people, what do they actually do when they are hungry? And if you actually want to know exactly what it means, stay hungry for 3 days. And you'll realize what it means. Just drink water with honey. It's possible to live a life with that. And one of the very horrible things that they actually can do is they can sell their children. And child trafficking is actually fueled with poverty. And it's a huge issue in Africa, in Asia, and also in America for different reasons in developed countries. But that is an issue. And one of the other dimensions of it is, especially in Pakistan, there have been children who have been sold to Taliban to become suicide bombers. And that's what hunger can do. So it's actually not something to think about when there are 10 billion people. It's actually right now. It's happening. And the threat of food security is much closer to home than we want to believe.
Thank you, Fatima. I think that was a very important statement on the consequences that we are experiencing right now already. So thank you very much. I would like to thank all the participants of this panel discussion and also for you as speakers this morning. I mean, they really deserve a big round of applause. And I would like now to turn the floor over to Hans Groth.